No, India is a very important point you raise, because India has a long tradition of peacekeeping. India was in the Congo, was the largest force there, and I had very often Indian troops under my command, and they're really professional soldiers, and they have always followed a non-aligned policy. So I think they would be, maybe they would be even the main body of a peacekeeping force like that,
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you today General Günther Greindl. General Grindel is an Austrian military expert in peacekeeping who's holding a master's degree in civil engineering and political science. Among other positions, he served as the commander of the United Nations force in Cyprus from 1981 to 89, and as an inspector general for the United Nations Protection Force. In the year 2000, he became the first Austrian military representative to the European Union and to NATO. In 2002, he was promoted to the rank of general. He is the founding president of the Association of Austrian Peacekeepers. General Grindel, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. Yes.
So, General, I wanted to talk to you because you wrote several articles that were critical about Austria's role in these European security affairs, and you are an expert on peacekeeping. So can we maybe start with peacekeeping more generally? What exactly is it? How is peacekeeping different from military interventions? And what has Austria's role, or what was the role of neutral states so far in peacekeeping operations?
Well, during the Cold War, of course, the peacekeeping operations were authorized by the United Nations, by the Security Council. At that time, the United Nations Security Council still was working. Now, of course, it's blocked, so it will be difficult, presumably, to find a mandate for peacekeeping operations. But the important thing is that peacekeeping operations are authorized by the Security Council, and therefore are different from a military intervention. They are geared to promote understanding between the two parties, to, of course, separate them. This is one of the big issues, but to try to build trust. And peacekeeping does not moralize, so to speak, does not judge parties who is right, who is wrong, but tries to establish channels again, to build trust, and of course to prevent the recurrence of fighting. And there are different methods, there are areas of separation which you can establish. You can position troops, interblocking positions, and there are various techniques, which you use in peacekeeping operations. But the important thing is, there was one famous statement in a British newspaper once about peacekeeping, where they said, peacekeeping is not a job for soldiers, but only soldiers can do it, because it has both elements. It has the element of diplomacy and has the element of military deployment.
The interesting thing about peacekeeping in the United Nations is that the UN was originally not designed to do peacekeeping. It's something that came on top only later, I think in the context of the Korean War, in order to separate the two. It was kind of ad hoc added to the mandates of the United Nations. Now, why is it that you, as a soldier from a neutral country, were then also able to participate in those missions? Are peacekeepers, or peacekeeping when it works, is it itself a form of a neutral way of mediation?
Yes, because if you deploy forces between two opposing parties, yes, in a conflict, then of course it is very important that these troops which are interposed they are accepted by both parties. They are seen as not being hostile. And this is the reason why during the Cold War period, the neutral countries were basically those countries which provided the soldiers for peacekeeping operations. It was Finland, Sweden, Ireland, Austria, of course, or countries. There were, of course, was one very important NATO country, or two actually, who had also been part of peacekeeping operations, which was Norway and Canada. But they had a different kind of policy, they were not involved in this sort of conflicts, So for me, it was very interesting, for instance, when we were deployed on the Golan Heights. This was, of course, between Syria and Israel. And this was 10 years after the end of World War II. So the Israelis were rather critical about Austrian troops being deployed on the Golan Heights. But the UN said, look, the Austrians are neutral, so what is your problem? And the Israelis accepted, said, yes, they are now a neutral country, so we can accept them as peacekeeping force in between Israel and Syria. And it's quite interesting that when the Austrians left, this mission, the Israeli regretted it very much and said, look, the Austrians were the backbone of this mission, so we are very sorry that they are leaving. So there you see that neutrality is a very important aspect for operations, peacekeeping operations, of course, because it is important how the parties perceive these deployed troops. It's because when you are when you have a hostile attitude, you are not suitable for peacekeeping operations, of course.
You need to be accepted by both parties so that none of them.
You have to be accepted by both parties as being seen impartial, or not for.
And I'm going to ask a question that is purely hypothetical, because the war in Ukraine is still ongoing. But from your experience as somebody who was a peacekeeper, who do you think could play that role at the moment? Or like if fighting was to cease, who could be a peacekeeper in Ukraine if ever we get to the negotiation stage?
This is a very difficult question to answer. I think, that presumably a way out of this war would be some ceasefire with an interposing peacekeeping force. And then, of course, it's very important who would be suitable. This is your question. So I think, of course, that countries of the European Union would not be readily accepted. So we have to turn, presumably, to Latin America, Asian countries, African countries. Austria would be accepted if they would follow a policy of neutrality, and I regret very much that we are not a voice of peace in this conflict, because I think for a permanent neutral country like Austria, it would be very important to be always a voice of peace.
I'm from Switzerland, and Switzerland neither. There's no.
Switzerland. I think Switzerland would be acceptable. I think Switzerland is already very much engaged in the Ukraine, so the Red Cross, and they're doing a very, very, very good job there. So I think yes, Switzerland is not a member of the EU, so presumably it would be acceptable.
How about the Indians? India has quite a bit of peacekeeping capacity.
India. No, India is a very, very important point you raise, because India has a long tradition of peacekeeping. India was in the Congo, was the largest force there, and I had very often Indian troops under my command, and they're really professional soldiers. And they have always followed a non-aligned policy. So I think they would be, maybe they would be even the main body of a peacekeeping force like that,
And they're being courted at the moment by both sides, right? The Russians, as much as the Europeans and Americans, they would both like to have the Indians on their side, and they're not picking sides.
No, they're not. They are not really taking a side, you know. And India, you know, when you look at the 𝗓𝗁𝘂𝘁𝘁𝘁, at the Indian-Pakistan mission, you know, there are these principles which have been at that time already in 1948 laid down by India and Pakistan for peacekeeping operations. So they have a real tradition in a kind of organizing, interposing forces. You know? So I think they would be a very important partner if something like that would be established in the Ukraine. Yes, I agree with that.
I would very much like to see that come through, just also for the fact that we would need somebody, actually a force, probably in Ukraine, a third-party force, in order to make sure that these two sides would be separated. Because we saw, unfortunately, what happened with the Minsk agreement. That was not externally enforced, and it never became anything. Do you think the Minsk agreement could have benefited from actual peacekeeping?
Well, the Minsk agreement, unfortunately, is a failure. Yeah? Was a failure, is a failure, and you could now look at it. Who is responsible that the Minsk agreement failed? You know, but I think that those who negotiated the agreement were not following up. They were happy with the agreement and then lost, so to speak, interest really to follow up with political actions. And yes, Minsk agreement, I think, is dead. So cannot be revived. We have now a different situation. The Minsk agreement would have been something maybe in March 2022, when there was this first negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. But I think that now the situation has gone beyond that, and so we are faced with a new challenge here, and one would have to negotiate a different kind of ceasefire.
Right. Let me maybe move forward to a question about the European Union. So Austria is a neutral country inside the EU. Austria is therefore also bound to the common security and defense policy. And Europe, or the EU has recently introduced several policy vehicles that I think are quite problematic to a neutral country like Austria. One is the so-called peace facility, which I really find very Orwellian named, because what the peace facility does is, because the EU budget itself cannot be used to fuel any conflicts, it's forbidden by the way the EU is founded, an external budget was created that is not under the standard EU rules, where states can give money to, including Austria, and then from that pot of money, you pay for everything from humanitarian aid to Ukraine up to weapons and shells and so on that are then bought on the international market and given to Ukraine. Now, this peace facility strikes me as a big problem to a neutral like Austria. The second thing is the idea of this rapid response force that recently came up and that the EU is about to build, which really looks like an EU army to me, although it now has a very different name. What do you make of these two developments in the EU?
Well, the peace facility was originally, the idea that was created was to help Africa, because the Africans always said, we have troops, but we don't have the equipment, you know, we don't have the money. And so the idea was to help, particularly the African Union, for peacekeeping operations in Africa. Now it has taken a different turn. Well, this is a development. I do not want to comment whether it's good or bad, but it's a fact, you know. And as far as it comes to this rapid response force, or the battle groups, right, which we have since a long time, which have been, by the way, never deployed, you know, which is quite interesting, because to deploy this battle group is a very difficult decision-making process necessary. I mean, the battle groups had, of course, an advantage, and Austria has taken part, and I'm really for it that we take part, because they have the big advantage of being a training ground, you know, for multinational forces, and this they have delivered. But now, to deploy a battle group like that, I think the EU can only do this under a UN mandate. If there would not be a mandate from the Security Council, it would be a failure. And therefore, I have no problems if the Austrians take part in these battle groups, because they are meant for deployment abroad for peacekeeping operations. This would be the ideal group for a peacekeeping operation if it would be accepted, because under a UN Security Council mandate, they could be deployed for this kind of operations. So, but they don't have any other significance, in my opinion. It's 5,000 troops, so this doesn't have any. It's part of an effort, to coordinate the military training in the EU.
But isn't there a danger that this nucleus that's being created now as a battle group, that could be expanded and that it could be used offensively? Because we have seen this already happening with NATO. NATO was supposed to be a defensive force, right? Only if attacked it would respond. And then we saw suddenly the idea emerge out of area or out of business. And the NATO troops went all the way to Afghanistan, and they were used to attack Belgrade, and NATO forces bombed Libya. I am quite I know you're a military man, but I'm quite afraid of militaries, because once you have them, isn't there always the danger that suddenly politicians get the idea we should use them if we already have them?
Yes, of course you have a point, but there's a big difference between NATO and the EU. NATO has a partner which has the potential to deploy and support military troops, and this, without the United States, NATO would not be able also to deploy any troops anywhere, So, and the EU will not be, without the support of the United States, will not be in a position to deploy troops anywhere, rather than the peacekeeping operations. And then you must understand, there are 5-6 nations involved to form this battle group, which is always a rolling participation, and so you need 5 parliaments or five governments, to agree to such a deployment, which is very difficult. And where's the logistic support? So I don't see this danger. I see these battle groups. This would be an ideal force, to support United Nations for peacekeeping operations. Remember, we had once this effort of 𝗔𝗯𝘂𝘁𝘁𝘁. I know whether this means something to you. This was a Danish initiative, a standby high readiness brigade, to form the EU, where the EU countries formed a standby high readiness brigade, was meant to support the UN, in case of peacekeeping operations. Actually, the battle groups would be this ideal military unit to do that, So let's see how things go, But I think that in the long run, the EU must rethink its policy. The EU is not a military force. The EU was created for different purposes. The EU was created to be a force of trade, of peace, and fully in line with the UN Charter. And so we'll see what development the EU will take, in the wake of this new surging war in Europe. We are going back. We are going 30 years back to Cold War, and this cannot be in the interest of Europe.
I had a talk with Ambassador Chas Freeman, U.S. Diplomat, and he was making the argument that we are not going to look back to the Cold War. We are going back to the 19th century, where you just have different groups of countries, and they are not afraid anymore to use military force in order to achieve political aims. Because what we are seeing now is that you can even have a conventional war with a nuclear power, And well, there you go. You've got soldiers on the ground, boots on the ground, and they fight each other. It's quite sad. It's very sad. So in that context, my question would be like, what can the EU do in order to keep that dynamic down? Like, how do we get back to diplomacy instead of warfare?
Yeah, but in reality, we are already in a Cold War. You know, what is the Cold War? The Cold War is that you keep it below the nuclear level, you know. But the Cold War is you have no communications. You don't. You have a line, you know, which you're gonna cross. You have an enemy, you know. You don't understand. Your interests, common interests, are not anymore valuable, you know. So you have your own. Each group has its own view of the world, so to speak. You know, there's no common understanding anymore, and this is already there. You know, so I think what we will see a new Iron Curtain in Europe. You know, if Russia is part of Europe, you know, is Russia part of Europe? You know, this is now debatable also, you know. So I think that to overcome this, it will be very difficult, but we all must work, you know, for peace. And this is what is my point, you know. I miss the voices for peace, you know. We have only voices for war and confrontation, you know, and I miss the voices for peace, because a voice for peace will first look at what are the interests, what are our own interests, what are the interests of the United States, what are the interests of Russia, you know, and then try to come to some understanding what can be done, you know, to accommodate this interest and come to a common approach, you know, like we had in the 90s and in the also in the OSCE, you know. This was the keystone development of the OSCE, the common and indivisible security. You know, this vision, we have lost this vision. You know, but security is of our common, is a common interest of all of us. This vision we have lost.
We have thrown that vision out, right? That vision is something that was actively rejected by the West, because the Russians have said over and over again, we want to negotiate the security structure in Europe. Or do you see, because I think it was the West that did the mistake, that should have said, yes, Russia, let's sit down, let's have a security conference, and let's do with Ukraine what happened with Austria back in '55, because that plot of land should obviously be neutral, should obviously not belong to anyone, except to itself.
Yes. Yeah. Of course, you know, if you look at, and this is why I think that neutrality is an important keystone for peace and security. Because we are now discussing in Austria neutrality only under the aspect of security. This is, of course, not the whole story. You know, I think we have to distinguish between temporary neutrality or permanent neutrality. You know? Permanent neutrality is more than only about security. Temporary neutrality is basically about security. You know, these are these buffer states which have been created and so on. You know, and Sweden, for instance, and Finland, of course, they were never permanent neutral. You know, and they were non-aligned states. So, but a permanent neutral state like Austria, this is more than or comprises more than the aspect of security. It's an attitude. It's an attitude towards peace, you know. And this is what I'm missing, and this is why I'm concerned, and this is why I'm trying to at least make this again a point of discussion. You know, that we need also in the EU, you know, governments and states who are not following this logic of war, you know. I mean, you don't need, of course, to oppose actions which the EU is trying to do, but at least you have to make a few points, you know, and find the right time and the right language, you know, to also speak about what can be done to end a war and not to continue it, you know.
How is it that you, as a military man, are so much in favor of a diplomatic way out? I mean, this is, I think, I would not understand the answer to that, but I would like to hear it from you. Why is it that you, as a military man, are so much against the use of military force?
Because I've been in many conflicts, you know, and I've seen that that war is basically destruction, you know, and in the most time, achieves nothing. At the end, you know, you have to come to a settlement and to a solution. And sometimes, you know, war is fought for reasons which are really not so important, you know. I mean, is it really so important whether Ukraine is a neutral country or a part of NATO? You know, is this the key to a solution, right? So I think if you have a common understanding and try to analyze also the conflicts, the reasons for a conflict, you know, because only if you look at how a conflict is developed, you know, a war is always at the end of a process, of a conflict, which could have been stopped if people would have been more reasonable in the first place, you know. And this, with this idea, you know, then you find that a war is not the solution, you know. And now we see, you know, what will be the end of war. The Ukraine will be a country destructed, you know, will be a lot of damage is done, a lot of dead people, you know, soldiers die. And for what reason? You know, we could have, I think there should be a possibility to find the solutions if we have the common interests in mind, you know, as it was part of the cooperative security of the OSCE. And, you know, a key point, this is the key point of cooperative security. You know. Cooperative security has always two winners, you know. If you have an opposing force, you know, then one side wants to win, you know, and wants to be the victor, you know. But in a cooperative security, you try to accommodate both sides, you know. This is the difference.
People who oppose what you're saying would immediately argue, but General, obviously Vladimir Putin doesn't want peace. Obviously he wants war because he's evil, because he's an imperialist, because he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. And this person only understands the language of war in order to stop him. What do you reply to these people?
Yeah, the question is, it really the truth which we are telling? You know,
no, it's not.
Have we ever talked? Have we ever talked with? If you cut all channels, you know, and never talk with the opposing force or with the enemy, so to speak, you know, you are not really knowing what he wants. You know, I mean, you could of course quote other attitudes of Putin, you know. I mean, in 2001, he was applauded, you know, in the Bundestag, you know, or in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, you know. He already, you know, warned we are going the wrong way if we not building trust between us and so on, you know. So it is very difficult, you know. What is really in his mind? I don't know, you know. But on the other hand, where's the proof that he really wants to attack Europe or so? You know, where is it really realistic? I don't know, you know. I think we would know if we would find a way to talk to each other.
Now, I mean, my answer would be that Putin and the Russians have been negotiating the whole time for 8 years, the Minsk agreements, and for 8 years between 14 until 22. This was negotiation the whole time, the whole entire time. And even at the end of March, we had negotiations. My point would be, no, negotiations were constantly sabotaged by Western forces, and constantly the Russians were lied to. But maybe we don't have to go that far. Let me ask you about another topic, the one that we came together in the first place today, Sky Shield.
Let me just say one thing, because it comes to my mind now, what you said, could we know if what Putin wants? Why are we not asking? You had this African peace mission, and he was waving with this document, which was signed. He said, look, we had that agreement. Here are the signatures. Why are we not asking Putin and say, show us this document? Is it true? Is this what you were waving with this document? Is this a fake document, or is it really true that the Ukrainians signed this agreement, which was an agreement which was very reasonable if you look at it, So what I want to say is, we have broken all communications. We're not talking to each other anymore. And this is the problem.
And we know he would, because your chancellor, Nehammer, he went and met Putin a year ago. He was the first Western leader to meet him. And Putin said, yes, if you want to come to Moscow, come.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be impossible. It takes a phone call.
No. Okay, but you had another question, right?
Yeah, I had a question about Sky Shield. So the Germans a year ago came up with the idea of creating a common European radar system, basically in order to defend against incoming missiles from, who could it be? Like probably the Russians, right? And they asked Austria and Switzerland to join, and actually both governments last month signed a memorandum of understanding saying like, yeah, we want to join. Could you explain to me a bit more what Sky Shield exactly is, how it's supposed to work, and what you think about Austrian and Swiss cooperation in this scheme?
What Sky Shield is and how it's going to work, I cannot tell you, because everybody is saying we have signed this agreement because we don't know how it's developed, and we want to be from the beginning there to know how it's developed and to can influence it, So obviously, some people are saying it's only a community for common purchases, to have better prices on the market. But if you look at if you look at Sky Shield, as I think it's designed, it was intended, is of course protection against missile attacks on Europe, And if that is the case, then everybody, it's clear that, for a neutral country, it will be very difficult to participate there, because then you are part of an alliance, This is quite obvious, So we really don't know how this Sky Shield initiative will develop. It's quite interesting that many countries are not, European countries are not part of it. France is not part of it. Poland is not part of it. Italy, Bulgaria, Romania. So I think it's too early to say how this thing develops. But what I was saying and what my assessment is, it's the logic of the Cold War again. Back to the Cold War. And it's the start of a new arms race. And this is the problem, We will invest lots of money and we will have a perceived security, which will always be a security under threat of attack, Instead of going another track, is to have a cooperative security, which we were trying to build in the 90s and up to year 2014, it worked, So, Therefore, I think this Sky Shield initiative will at the end not really protect Europe. If we will have a war in Europe, it's impossible to protect against missile attacks and of hypersonic missiles. The area is too big, you would presumably need hundreds of Patriot batteries, to protect Europe really from missile attacks, And then it's an arms race. So if there is the sense that there is a protection, of course, the Russians will develop something which will break this shield, and then they have to start again, to develop something which will be again a protection against a certain weapon. So we are back to the arms race, and this is the problem,
Right. And what we are seeing at the moment is that even neutral countries in Europe are willing to just, in the idea of an arms race, to participate in that idea, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's surprising for me, surprising that Austria and Switzerland are among the first the states signing up for this, at least for this declaration. Under the, I think the justification is we need to be informed, right? So we need to know what's going on, and we cannot protect ourselves alone, you know. Quite interesting, you know. Israel can do that, you know, so why couldn't we do that if we really wanted? But I see the point, you know, but the information we can also get, you know, if you look at the joint European NATO declaration of January 23, you know, there is a point in it, you know, which quite clearly says that non-NATO nations of the EU should be informed of what's going on in NATO, you know, as far as their security is concerned. So I think that we would have also other ways of being informed what's going on in 𝗂𝘁𝘂𝘁𝘁, you know. So my point was, why need we to go first? You know, why don't we wait and see how things develop? Maybe could also be that we have a kind of armistice in 6 months or in a year's time in Ukraine, and maybe we will have negotiations between the United States and Russia again, you know, and we will have a peacekeeping force. So, you know, there will be a lot of developments, but we want to follow this logic now. Russia is the eternal enemy, and therefore we have to go back to the logic of Cold War.
Yeah, and it's the logic of war. You know, I keep reminding my friends that the best defense is not having an enemy. Because it's quite funny how the Europeans are so focused on Russia, saying Russia is obviously so evil and such a danger, and China is so evil and such a danger. And then I talked to a Mongolian diplomat, and Mongolia is sandwiched between Russia and China. And I asked him, aren't you afraid of Russia? And he looked at me bewildered and said, no, we have no problems with the Russians. They're not threatening us. The Chinese neither. There's no problem. We have a cooperative arrangement with both of them. We're fine. It's quite amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, but you make a very important point. You know, if you have an alliance, you need an enemy. Otherwise, the alliance falls apart. You know. Yep. And if you look at the development of NATO, you know, when the Soviet Union broke down, you know, NATO was in real trouble. You know, they didn't know we dissolve it or what are we going to do, you know, and then of course there was this out of area concept, you know, which gave it a little bit of a new task, you know, but then they found out this is not so easy, you know, so we will not be able to have NATO being the policeman of the whole world, and now of course they have the enemy again, but the point is exactly, you know, we're coming back to the same idea which we already discussed. If you lose your channels of communication, you know, if you don't analyze and accept what are interests of the different partners of a cooperative security arrangement, and if you don't accept that only, how can I say, only a balance of interests, you know, will guarantee a stable situation, you know, then of course you end up always with having an enemy, and you need an enemy, you know, because otherwise you cannot justify all these expenses, you know. So it is we are at the merging of a new world order, I think, you know. I think that the hegemony of the United States may last another 20 or 30 years, you know, but cannot last forever, because a hegemony always, we will always be challenged by those, you know, who are under threat of this hegemony, you know, and it's only a question of time until they are strong enough to get rid of it, you know, and the better project would be, to find a common understanding and a balance of interests. This would be the better way. And this is what we had. This is what we had in the 90s and in the years early 2000s, and we lost it. And we should really think and have a strong incentive. Why did it go wrong? And what can we do that when we are able to establish something like similar again, which I think should be the goal, what could we do that it doesn't go wrong then?
Yeah, it's quite fascinating. Like the US and Europe won the Cold War and then lost the peace. We literally lost the structures that we had in order to have peace. We lost, it's such a European thing to do, because we Europeans keep doing that again and again and again.
Yes. Yeah, you are right. Europe was the battlefield, for 600-700 years, since the Roman times, actually. Europe was always a battlefield. And then we won this Cold War, and we had this idea of having a peaceful Europe, which is only, in my view, able to have also peace with Russia. If you don't have peace with Russia, you will not have a peaceful Europe. This the proof is now again here, and I think that we don't have enough. How can I say, politicians or enough support for the idea of what do we need to do to get rid of being Europe the battlefield of the world all the time, because now if the escalation continues, we will have again in Europe, we have already this destruction in Ukraine, I mean, we are using cluster bombs in Ukraine, we are dispersing them in European territory, this is insane, so, but yeah, it's the logic of war, a war, as Clausen said, war is always moving towards the extreme, and this is why I say, we need a different voice. We need voices of peace in order to stop this escalation to the extreme.
Yeah, and I would like to reiterate my plea to Indian and African friends: please help us Europeans not to kill ourselves, because that's what we keep doing. General Greindl, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for the talk. I hope to talk to you soon again. Yes, and thank you, and yeah, let's see what happens. We will be very surprised, maybe. You don't know, the future, we cannot tell the future, and we don't know. Maybe in a year we are sitting here and talking about who should take part in the peacekeeping force in the Ukraine. Who knows, Hopefully. General Greindl, thank you very much. Yes. Thank you. Bye-bye.